the Infrastructure Health and Safety Association, which is construction and transportation and utilities. Then there's Workplace Safety North, which actually is more geographic, but they also deal with forestry and mining. And then the Public Services Health and Safety Association, which covers many of us who work in the public services and universities and schools and the arts and culture. And then there's two other partners, one of which is OCOW, so we're with a focus on occupational health. And from a clinical perspective as well as a program prevention perspective, and then the Workers' Health and Safety Center, which is focused on training. And then there are also a number of research institutes that receive partial funding. So the Institute for Work and Health is one of them, and there's 3 centers of excellence for research. One in occupational disease at St. Michael's, one in musculoskeletal disorders, that's at Waterloo, and one that's just called Precarious, occupational safety and health, that's at Laurentian in the Sudbury. So altogether, that's the system that we talk about. Although, sorry, I'm going to stop talking in a minute now, but we're recognizing, and some of Kevin's slides already allude to that the system by itself can't solve everything, right? And so just like this conference is an intersection of issues, we need to find the points of intersection with other ministries, other community partners in order to have holistic and I think successful approach. That's a lot of why we have this session. Yeah.
So Michael's presentation was to be very contextual.
Can I stop you and ask you to use a mic?
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm just.
So the point that I took from Michael's presentation was that to be contextual. But then the point that I took from Peter's presentation was to take the focus of vulnerability to be hazards without, to focus vulnerability as hazards without protection. Now, if you do take that focus, do you think that how we target young workers and recent immigrants and temporary agency workers should still be different? So the focus may be the same, but do you think the strategy should be different?
Yeah, so I think the context, so things around temporary workers more likely to be exposed to hazards without protections, I guess how the context fits into our framework. In terms of, do I think the focus should be different? Yeah, I think if we focused on hazards and providing, or if we focused on making no worker in Ontario exposed to hazards with inadequate protections, we could actually achieve that. We're never going to get buy-in that no work in Ontario should be temporary. We're never going to get buy-in that we have to get all the young workers out of the labour market. But we can get buy-in from everyone that everyone should have protections. And we have, we've got a measure. It's not a perfect measure. There could be other ways to measure it. But if we said we wanted to make sure every worker in Ontario who was exposed to hazards had adequate protections in place, it would shift our focus because we'd focus across industries and would identify where are those workers and what interventions do we need to put in place to ensure that no worker is exposed to hazards with inadequate protections. And as I said, it gives us a mechanism to get to zero vulnerability, which is, what I would like.
What's your question around whether we need to have different approaches for different traditional groupings or as well?
Well, I think if we think about the 3 different types of protections that we talk about, there are some groups, such as temporary workers and young workers, who are exposed to all those inadequacies. There are other people in smaller places who are exposed to policy and procedures more than others. I do think if we started thinking and defining vulnerability differently, we could identify in which industry. So we've looked in our surveys, if we were to rank industries from best to worst, the ranking changes depending on which protection we're focusing on. And so if we start focusing on the protections, so if we said, instead of saying let's focus on new and young workers, I would say let's find out what it is about new and young workers that differentiates them from old and slow workers. And in terms of the stuff from today, a little bit around policy and procedures, it's a little bit around awareness, it's a little bit about empowerment, but I think that would each take very different approaches. So awareness, awareness is, we're doing quite well in the province around awareness. I think awareness is the hardest thing to measure, but there are activities around awareness. Policy and procedures will require very different approaches, where the workplace is the focus, and empowerment, I don't know what approaches are going to be the most beneficial to changing empowerment, but that is, I think, where we need to go, because that's the hardest thing to do. And as I said, some of the stuff Mishak will present tomorrow is around trying to understand from recent immigrants, what would it take to make them feel more empowered.
Yeah, sorry, just so that it's...
You get that one, I guess.
but yeah, Kevin has something to add too. So it's great.
So I just have another follow-up question. Can you give an example of what's hazards without protections?
Yeah.
So I can...
So I guess the way we define it, as I said, I'm not saying this is the only way you could define it. The way we define it is we have a list of 9 hazards, and if you're exposed to that, so they include things like working at heights, working with hazardous material, doing repetitive tasks, being exposed to bullying and harassment. If you're exposed to those hazards on a weekly basis or more, you're exposed to hazards. And then we define inadequate protections as disagreement with one or more of the questions within each of our policy questions, the 7 policy questions, the 6 awareness questions, or the 5 empowerment questions. So if a worker disagrees with one or more of those, that's defined as inadequate. We've looked at it in different ways, like if you disagree with 2 or 3. As I said before, generally speaking, most people tend to agree with most or all of the questions. They don't tend to say, oh no, it's just I couldn't speak up, but I do feel like all these other things are in place. And so that's how we're defining it. But I'm not saying that's the only way you could define it, and I'm not saying that's the right way to define it, but we need to define it in some way if we want to measure change or want to measure which groups are vulnerable in which ways.
Kevin, you wanted to add
So
something?
just wanted to say that I think a lot of thinking is around what Peter said about the differentiated approach that we're going to have to use to reach different groups. I think it was Michael who also said one size doesn't fit all, albeit within a different context. But coming out of the conversations event on the 25th around the definition of a vulnerable worker, these were some words that the stakeholders said they would want us to start to consider when we're looking at defining workplace vulnerability or vulnerable workers. And these are the workers with vulnerability factors, right? We should focus on context or the concept of contextual, situational, and you spoke about when you said we need to have or think about a whole suite of approaches when we're looking at the different factors, the awareness factors, empowerment factors, the policy factors, dynamic, vulnerability to work, injury or illness, workplace vulnerabilities, or to look at workplace vulnerability as a lens. And these are some of the words they say that we should not include in a reconceptualization of vulnerable workers or workplace vulnerability. They do not want us to use the words vulnerable worker. Neither do they want us to use the word marginalization or to speak about certain groups of workers. So I think we are at a point where we can look at the needs in the different sectors and the groups, and then think about initiatives that can best respond to those needs. We can't begin to perpetuate the same labels because people are offended and people do not think that those labels help us to produce the right outcomes, and so the conversation is changing.
Right. Thanks. So did you have another question?
I guess it's a comment. Thank you very much. I found that thought-provoking for myself. I'm Mika from the University of British Columbia. I don't know if you'd agree with this comment, but after hearing all 3 of those talks, I'm left with the impression, broadly speaking, that it's not to our advantage in terms of having an impact to dissect this too much. And what I mean by that is, what I heard from Michael is, to not dissect all of our protections and regulations, but to think about it as worker rights. And Peter's saying, don't think about it as age and sex and and new immigrant status, but to think about it as protections in the workplace. And even now, Kevin, what you just said was don't dissect this. Talk about it generally as needs. So I don't know if you would agree with that takeaway message, but that's what I'm walking away with right now.
I think I certainly agree with it. There are people who, when you say, let's talk about vulnerable workers. So let's talk about seasonal agricultural workers. Why seasonal agricultural workers? Why young workers am I not vulnerable? And so you get into a conversation that is cyclical, circular. You never get out of it because people think that where they are exposes them to hazards to varying degrees. And so they think that they're in hazardous situations. So I think that for us to begin now to shift our focus to protections for workers across the system is perhaps the more socially acceptable thing for us to begin to do.
I would agree. Although I think we should dissect it a little.
Of course.
Only to identify the things that we can change. Because I think if we identify the things we can change, so, you know, it's not unreasonable to expect that we could have a system for temporary migrant workers in agriculture that would protect them. We could put those things in place. We could identify what those things were and we could do stuff around that. The solution is not that they're always vulnerable because they're temporary migrant workers. They're vulnerable because they lack power. And so some of the stuff in the workplace review, I think, has gone a bit of a way to that. So I think we do need to think about what are the modifiable factors, and let's focus on those, because the ministry has been very engaged in this process. Is that, you know, vulnerability? At its heart, it's a dynamic process. You can be vulnerable one week and you can be not vulnerable the next week. Same worker. And so we need to recognise that if certain things happen, people will become vulnerable, and if certain things happen, people might not become vulnerable, and that helps us. So I think a little bit of dissections on that.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks for all of the great presentations. It's been really great. I was wondering, Peter, specifically about the survey, what the purpose is in terms of how it could be used. Because I think there's a lot of great things in there, but is the idea that it would be a wide-scale randomized survey that's like linked to sector? Would it be linked to specific workplaces? Is it something that a workplace itself could use voluntarily? What's the thought around?
Yeah, so it could be all of the above. So I think at the moment, what's happened, so we've done we've put the survey into the field a couple of different times, and one of the primary purposes of that was to understand the impact of the new mandatory awareness training in Ontario compared to British Columbia. So we've done it in that way. We have had workplaces who have also used the survey to monitor their workers to identify particular groups, units based on geography or different sectors of their organisation which need to be targeted in different ways, and to see that change. So as I said, one of the things is when you use a measure like ours, you can actually see changes that occur over time. Ideally, it should, I don't know if our survey, but ideally a survey I think should be used across the province on an annual basis. I mean, what information do we currently collect around hazards and protections in Ontario or across Canada? That's what we collect. We have no federally mandated survey that collects any of that information. We have no provincially mandated survey that collects any of that information. We have no information. We have prevention agencies across Canada using workers' compensation claims. That system needs to change. We need to have, and I think the ministry has identified this, we need more intelligent data collection systems.
Yeah, I think the thing that's really hard is the buy-in, because I think the workplaces who are wanting to use this are probably not the ones that need it the most. And so maybe it's mandating everyone has to do it, or...
We've had discussions with the WSOB, they have a Work Well program, which is for their poor performers, about using the survey, and they've sort of said, well, because one of the metrics I use is, have you had any claims submitted in the last 6 months? And workplaces can make sure there are no claims submitted through a variety of different reasons. If you did a survey, a self-reported anonymised employee survey, the only way you could make sure that you're improving on that is to put those things in place where your employers would agree with the statements. And you could actually monitor, and I don't know if the board will do this or not, but we certainly chatted with them about it. You could do that. You could monitor those workplaces over time, allow their employees to respond anonymously and tell you if they feel like those systems are in place. You could do it.
Perfect, thank you.
Great, thanks.
Hi, I'm Farah Malani. I have a question. I definitely agree that it's important to focus on work context and modifiable factors, but the thing I'm grappling with is, one of the reasons to focus on immigrants as a group is to focus on solutions within the broad context of determinants that affect them in unique ways, and workplaces are part of that web of determinants. And I'm just wondering, what the risk might be of taking away that kind of focus.
That type of focus on specific groups?
On immigrants.
Oh, well, it's interesting, the perspectives that Peter and I mentioned. Actually, I don't think they're in competition, and I have a feeling based on the discussion that has started, the conversation that has started, that we'll have the two things, we'll have parallel streams, because when Peter spoke, I reflected a little bit. There are some systemic things, there are some structural things, there are some factors that are just very persistent that affect some groups more than other groups. And those things were identified at the first event on the 25th. I don't think we could have listed them and then on the 22nd of May just leap over them and go into a different type of direction. I think we'll go back to them and to say, so what are we going to do for these seasonal agricultural workers? What are we going to do for the young workers who experience vulnerability in a particular way because of the factors that we were informed about, and so forth for the temporary agency workers and for new immigrants. But I think at the same time there's going to be increased understanding for the need for us to have a better system of protection across the board, so that all workers, regardless of the sector or the groups that we decide to put them in, they feel more protected and they feel safer.
So I agree with Kevin that I don't think, I think it is still important to document inequalities across immigrant and racialised groups in relation to all the factors I've mentioned. Same as it's important to document inequalities across age and sex groups. And I do think that potentially it's important to think about whether we need particular strategies for particular groups in relation to the same. So improving empowerment, would it be different among immigrant workers than it would be among non-immigrant workers? And potentially might, I think we need to think about that. But I do think by documenting the fact that these are the characteristics that place immigrants at increased risk, also helps us take the onus away from that it's an immigrant problem, because it's not an immigrant problem, it's a protection hazard problem. And if we focus on protection that hazards, groups like immigrants and young workers will be the most likely to benefit from that. But I think one of the risks we run when we focus on immigrants is it ends up as being language training. And that's not what we need. We actually need systems to address power inequalities that are more prevalent in those groups, because they're in very, as you would know, Farah, they're in very temporary, precarious employment relationships with survival jobs. We need to somehow readdress those imbalances, and maybe we could do that across the board for any worker who's in that situation.
Thanks so much.
Great, thank you. It actually is time's up unless there's anyone with a burning question. Hopefully lunch is outside the door. And I just would like to say thank you to Peter and to Kevin for taking the time to come and share their work. And I'm sure they'll both be around if you want to have a more direct conversation and questions or ideas. And we appreciate your ongoing engagement, and the conversation continue as we said with the ministry event. So thanks very much for coming.